again to the show. I'm Leslie Choice, and my guest today is Michael Ungar. He teaches at the School of Social Work at Dalhousie University. He's the author of 2 books, Playing at Being Bad and Too Safe for Their Own Good. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here, Leslie.
Now, in your latest book, you suggest that we're too worried and that we're overly protective of our kids. Why is that?
Well, I guess it has something to do with, and this is coming from the families themselves telling me and trying to bring me up to speed. They're telling me that in part it's because we have smaller families today, especially in middle-class, safe, secure communities throughout this country and elsewhere in the Western world. We have smaller families, we have more time, let's face it, to pay attention to our kids, to go to all their practices of soccer matches, and to really be involved with our kids. And I think somewhere in that mix of time and making our kids, maybe unfortunately, our projects, our social lives, we live vicariously through our kids a lot more perhaps than a generation ago.
Now, how can this actually be bad for our children and our teenagers?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? That how can our loving, caring, safe, protective, bubble wrapping, life jacket placing, helmeted lifestyles actually hurt our kids? And some of it doesn't. Some of it actually keeps them safe. Sure, I want helmets on my kids, and I want them seat belted in, and I want them street safe, and to know how to say no to strangers, and all those kinds of things. But at the same time, what kids tell me is that we also need what I call in Too Safe for Their Own Good, what we call the risk-taker's advantage, which is that they still need to be taking adventure, assuming responsibility for themselves and others. They still need to feel like they're out there figuring out their own lives. And if we step back from it for a moment and think about the child who's never had to cross a street, never had to walk to school, never had to decide what they eat, what they are going to wear, has never dealt with a sharp object or something hot, never operated a piece of machinery. If you get those kinds of kids, they only have 2 choices. One, they're going to become very compliant, withdrawn children who become very anxious, and we see those kids, unfortunately, in our universities and colleges. Or, of course, they do what I talked about in the first book, Playing at Being Bad, which was they kind of go out there and they have to make it up themselves, and they have to go out and find adventure and risk and responsibility all on their own. And unfortunately, for the kids who are driven that way, they often make some really, really bad choices that are completely preventable if we adults could offer them some adventure, some responsibility, much like we had when we were growing up ourselves.
You're actually advocating risk-taking in some particular way, which seems counterintuitive to some of us. You make certainly a compelling case for that. You finding that you're getting any flack from parents when you discuss this, or from other professionals in your field?
Surprisingly not. Now again, I am talking about kids growing up in safe communities. So where in fact statistically we know our kids are safer today than at any other time in history, in fact. All the stats are down. The truancy, the smoking, the drug use, even their sexual activity amongst kids today is actually going down. Crime, etc., etc. So actually what I'm hearing from parents is they're saying to me, thank God someone's finally saying this, because I wanted my kid, he's 7 years old, I wanted him to be able to go to the park by himself. I don't want to drive my kid to every practice, to every school meeting. I want my kids to do those things, just like I did growing up. And finally this book comes along, and I'm getting phone calls and emails and a deluge of those that are saying, finally, I feel like I'm giving permission back to myself to stand up to the messages and the stares from my neighbors and let my 7-year-old just go that 1 block and play on the slides down the street from me for 20 minutes. I'll check in on them and that type of thing. Or letting my teenager make some decisions about who she's dating, where she's going, even walking, getting from one house to another, or frankly, just getting to school on their own. That I'm finding parents beginning to say, hey, I did those things and I learned a lot of stuff about street sense. I learned a lot about myself. I felt more independent. It was really formative to how I grew up and became the person I am today. And I'm thinking that somewhere in the mix, we're forgetting that, we can take away all those experiences from our kids. We can take away all the dangerous toys. We can take away all the adventures, the bikes, all that kind of stuff. But then that kid is still going to one day drive a car, go away to college or university, is one day going to have a lot of responsibility for themselves and for others. And I just can't quite see how they're going to get from that cloistered 4-year-old, overprotected 14-year-old, to the independent and healthy and caring contributor to their community at 24. there's got to be steps along the way to get there.
We're going to take a short break right now. My guest today is Michael Ungar, and his book is Too Safe for Their Own Good, and we'll be back right after this.
If you'd like more information about this or any of the programs we produce at Mount St. Vincent University, call us or email. We welcome your comments.
And welcome back. My guest today is Michael Ungar. We're talking about teenagers and children. Part of my parental brain is still screaming, but the world is a dangerous place. There's lots of guns out there, and there are predators, and there are all those weirdos on the internet, and there's just like stacks and stacks of information and newspapers filled with the dangers that are there. What do you do about those dangers as a parent then, coming from the side that you're talking here?
The strategies which I talk about in Too Safe, the people are really good at finding solutions to this. They're able to say, for instance, well, maybe we don't send our 7-year-olds down to the playground anymore by themselves. We have cell phones. We have buddy systems. We have community policing. We have neighborhood watch. We have the crossing guards going through multiple security checks just to be there at 7 in the morning to walk our kids across the street. They go through police checks and child abuse registry checks, and they get training. This is to be a crossing guard. So I think we're adapting. We still can provide our kids. We can still put the helmets on when they're tobogganing and skiing and those kinds of activities. But then let's make sure that at the bottom of the hill we build a great big 6-foot pile of snow, so when they go off the toboggan with their helmet on, that they still feel like they're sort of on the edge of something. Here in Nova Scotia, I happen to know there's this whole group of people, and I meet the kids who love to go surfing. Now, the water is bloody cold.
Oh, I can't imagine anybody ever doing that.
I can't imagine anyone doing that. And yet, there's this real edgy thing to it. And surfing's not, let's face it, a little bit of a dangerous sport. The board, the water, all this kind of stuff. And yet, I think it's those kinds of experiences that we want to make sure that our kids do have some of those kinds of adventures, that we don't want to just simply take them to rides at Disney as the solution to somehow encouraging them to make that jump from childhood to adulthood. If you think about it, most cultures around this world have some sort of rites of passage, some sort of transmission of the culture, some way that they jump from that status as child to adult. And I really think that the onus is back on us, even if we are going to buy in that we have to protect them, to still make sure that within that bubble, that box that we put around them, that they have lots of adventure, lots of dangerous toys, for instance. Are they operating machinery, driving dirt bikes, navigating on buses, skateboarding down the street, bicycling? So they have a certain amount of street sense, all those kinds of things.
If we're talking about teenagers, guys and girls, I always think the guys being more attracted to the risk, needing more of the risk. Is that still the case, or is that just my interpretation?
Depends how you define the risk. I think the girls and the boys will sort of look at risk very differently, and more girls are looking for the skateboards and the bikes and the high adventure. One of the big ones you see a lot of young women rock climbing on the rock, the rock courts, the gyms, and that type of thing. So that's because think of that image as very, very sort of powerful and that kind of thing. So I think the gender definitely skews what it's going to look like, but the drive to, and some of the key messages they want to hear is, I'm responsible, I belong, I'm capable, I'm part of my community. Those are messages that they're going to still need to hear. Now, for 14-year-old girls, sometimes it's putting on the makeup and dressing like whoever the most recent pop star is, and putting on that air, and just testing out her world in that particular way. Now, I wish young women didn't have to fall into such gendered, stereotypical, sexist patterns to get that. But I can understand why they're doing it. And hopefully we can offer some alternatives as well, such as the rock climbing and other kinds of adventures. And the same thing for guys. Someone said to me recently, guys still seem to always want to blow things up. And there's a little bit of a truth in that, right? They want the machines and the gadgets and the video games and all that kind of stuff. And okay, so we provide some of that. Hopefully we can tame it a little bit, we can channel it, we can make it into a productive force as well. It doesn't only have to be destructive.
Okay, we're going to take a short break right now. My guest today is Michael Ungar, and his book is Too Safe for Their Own Good, and we'll be back right after this.
If you'd like more information about this or any of the programs we produce at Mount St. Vincent University, call us or email. We welcome your comments.
And welcome back. My guest today is Michael Ungar. We're talking about teenagers and children and the fact that we're making their lives too safe. You go so far as to say our houses are way too safe. They're even way too clean for the health of our children.
That's right, and there is actually some evidence growing in the medical field now that potentially a lot of the asthmas, a lot of our children's, some of the health problems which are becoming very current, they are beginning to wonder, and this is speculation still, that there are a lot of controlled studies right now going on around the world looking at whether or not taking away all the dirt and the access to germs early on is actually disadvantaging the immune systems of our children. In other words, when you see those commercials on television in which they're sort of cleaning everything meticulously, I mean, there's some advantage to that for sure, but at the same time, if we don't get some exposure to the germs and stuff around us, then our immune systems don't get activated. We know that for children. My argument is really more social and psychological. I'm using it more metaphorically, that I'm saying, look, if we don't also expose our kids' psychological immune systems, have them tested a little bit, if they never fail, this cult of self-esteem that we've built around our kids, telling them they're wonderful when maybe sometimes the message has to be, well, you could have tried a little bit harder. That in itself conveys to our kids that somehow they really don't have real worth. That I think somewhere along the line we do have to test our kids. We have to occasionally, hopefully, in a safe way with a nice soft cushion below them, let them fail, let them fall, let them bump themselves a little bit in life. We did it. It certainly told us something about ourselves. And I think from the kids I'm talking to, they often say that they don't mind that as long as there's around them parents, especially parents, and others who are going to be there to sort of catch them.
Yeah, it really is for a parent. It's one of the hardest things to watch your children fail at something. It just breaks your heart.
To draw back enough and say, okay, I'm going to let them mess up. I'm going to let that, I'm not going to tell them to put their bike away for the 18th time. I'm going to let the bike get stolen off my front lawn, and they're going to have to, out of their own allowance, buy another bike.
Oh boy.
But if you think about it, if we don't do that, then when their kids take our car, and they're going to take our car at 18, 19, and they're not going to lock the doors on the car, right? And they're not going to do something. And there's going to be a bigger consequence. And it's hard. My own partner and I with our own children, it's just a hard lesson to do for anybody.
Sure thing. Now, of course, you say there, in the midst of all the safety, we create these other dangers of inactivity, the couch potato, video games, all these things, and eating bad foods, which kind of goes along with just being safe and at home or something, and so you end up with diabetes and obesity and all these other things as a result.
Well, and yes, and that is perhaps the other side effects. We're seeing all kinds of side effects in the way we've set up our lifestyles. I mean, I'm kind of down sometimes on the way we've set up our suburbs, that we have to drive everywhere, and we know that driving, the distance you live from the center of a city is directly related to the incidence of obesity in most North American cities, because, of course, you're in the car more, your kids have to be driven everywhere. They're not navigating the streets, and they're also not learning the skills that they need to actually to do that. So in some ways, our own mania to protect our kids might, in fact, be disadvantaging them. The other thing, of course, we know from the statistics on crime and abuse and internet solicitations, that type of thing, is that your child is most at risk at home. Now this is going to come as a bit of a shock to most people, but if you really know the truth of the statistics, gun-related violence towards kids, the bulk of that, most of that happens in the home, by guns already in the home. We know that. If we also go to think about sexual abuse, physical abuse, neglect, all that, your child is more likely to be sexually abused and physically abused in their own home than anywhere else. And vast majority of those crimes take place in your own home. internet solicitations. 75% of all sexual solicitations happen on the computer when our children are in our own homes. Now I know this kind of, I say this kind of somewhat tongue-in-cheek.
It's safer out there in the real world.
Push them out the front door.
Throw them out the front door.
But if we are going to push them out the front door, make sure that we're also, monitoring them, that we've set up our community somewhat safe and all that. But once we have done that, and to a large extent we have done that, we really still need to get our kids out the front door.
Okay, so now they're out the front door, and then they're teenagers. The big three: drugs, alcohol, and sex. You almost seem to be promoting them.
No, quite the opposite. I don't want my kid doing drugs, drinking young, or having sex early. But
that's the risk-taking. That is very much associated with those
But they
things.
choose that when they don't have healthy tests for their bodies. They don't have access to substances that kind of bring with it a certain cachet. I mean, we smoke and we do drugs and other things often as a way of either for recreation or to jump the maturity gap. So I was amazed recently by an article in the paper that read, oh my, Starbucks. Kids are going to Starbucks and drinking Frappuccinos. And this should be awful, that kids are consuming too much caffeine. Well, okay, yeah, I'm concerned about it. But if we take away the alcohol and we take away the drugs and we take now away the caffeine, at what point do our kids ever learn any kind of moderation or an ability to sort of self-regulate? And what's more is, what will they themselves then choose to make that jump into adulthood? So of course the point is, we have to give our kids those messages. I'd rather them feel like they belong and they can put those airs on in the coffee shop than perhaps elsewhere on the street where they're less supervised and less under the social gaze. That's my take on it.
Okay. My guest today is Michael Ungar, and we're talking about his book, Too Safe for Their Own Good. And we're going to take a short break and be back right after this.
If you'd like more information about this or any of the programs we produce at Mount St. Vincent University, call us or email. We welcome your comments.
Hi, and I'm back with Mike Ungar. So suppose I've protected my teenager too much, or he or she has decided to take this comfortable route, kind of comes home, watches television, hangs around the house.
Or runs to the street for their own adventure and responsibility.
Well, I'm wondering if they're not adventurous enough, what can I do?
Oh, if they're sort of stuck, it's sort of more pulled back, which is actually what we're seeing a lot of.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. I always think about when I work with parents, and that's really reflected in the book, is I've been working a lot with parents and walking them through a series of steps. The first one is usually to start with themselves. What were you doing at that particular age? What was exciting for you? What kinds of risks and adventures did you have? And I often start with that because it gives me real clues.
I was hitchhiking, by the way.
You were hitchhiking.
That's
right. I think I may have been too, actually, a little bit. And now, so obviously we don't want our kids to hitchhike, but you had a drive or some sort of thing to get out there and do something independent. And I'm so often clued in to saying, well, if that was good for you, or that was in your culture, or that was something that you did, can you find a more reasonable substitute now? Now, often it's very specific to a particular family, and families have shown me lots of solutions. I mean, it could just be your kid is more quiet and likes sedentary sort of hobbies and stuff like that. But even then, I mean, I had a chemistry set. I was blowing things up when I was sort of a certain age.
Should have been, yes.
As I should have been, right? So I know that sometimes we want to make everything into a problem as well, but I mean, I think what you can, for instance, offer a kid even like that responsibility for themselves. They can still have a job. Often these kids are not against having work opportunities. If we think about modeling for them as well, I'm always big on that if we parents are sitting on the couch every evening just watching television, and then we're saying to the kid, well, get out, go with our friends and stuff. I don't know about that. I'm saying more if I'm knocking around in the garage or in the front yard, or I'm taking an interesting trip, or doing something outdoors, or simply, having some friends over or something like that, my kid's going to see that. I think that eventually connects for our children. By the way, if it becomes really sustained, of course, we're looking at something more psychological. I mean, there are kids who are depressed and they pull back from life. That's a much bigger problem, and of course that needs some sort of professional intervention.
I know that you work with troubled teenagers, and wondering how important is their story, their version of reality. My guess is that you don't sit down and lecture them and say, now you should do this and you should do that.
Doesn't work.
Doesn't work. Yeah.
In fact, and again, I sort of walk parents a little bit through some of those messages, but I really wanted the book to be much more about the kids' own stories. And I think to some extent, Too Safe kind of gets at that. It's kind of their wisdom brought forward and the wisdom of parents. I work with kids all over the world in countries like Palestine and Israel and throughout Africa and Asia. I have a large research project that's looking at risk and resilience in these kids. And what I've learned from them is you really do have to hear it from their point of view. Things that we as adults think make sense don't always make sense to the kids themselves. And things that they really want sometimes aren't that outrageous requests. I told you about going to work till 2 a.m. in the morning on a Saturday night at the local McDonald's or the Tim Hortons or something like that. I'm surprised by the number of kids who get resistance to those kinds of things that they want to do. And sometimes even our most delinquent kids that I meet in jails here in Canada will tell me, gosh, I still wish I had had a job. And you're a delinquent. What are you talking about? You steal cars and you do all kinds of nasty things. He said, well, no, I just wanted to belong. I want a place in my community is what they're saying. So I think that there's I think if we really listen closely and we don't judge so much and we begin to look at the messages below what the kid is saying, we often find there the clues to the right thing to offer them that needn't put them or anyone else in harm's way.
Okay, I noticed that when you're speaking of troubled teenagers and troubled youth, the word resilience comes up often. What exactly does that mean in terms of these kids out there? How do they have this resilience?
Well, the resilience refers to your capacity to bounce back, but it also means that it's not just something you yourself do. You don't just kind of survive because you wish it. You survive in part because of what you have inside you, but also because you're in a whole community of concern. You have your parents, you have schools, you have teachers, you have coaches, you have resources around you. And that's what I really mean is that I think a lot of kids, they seem to bounce back, and this is what my research shows me, and as well as my clinical practice. Kids bounce back when they're provided things like rites of passage, access to adventure, a real sense of responsibility both for themselves and others. Around the globe, almost universally, in many different countries and many different cultures, that is almost a given, that those things really do predict that our kids will get through their adolescence well and eventually become what I call a caring, competent contributor to their communities, the 4 Cs.
And that's certainly an encouraging note to end on. Michael Ungar, thanks for being on the show.
Pleasure to be here, Leslie.
And thanks for watching. I'll see you again next time.